Hi, this is Sebastian Braxton, and welcome back to Between the Lines. Now, the last time that we met, we talked about the fact that slaves cost different prices, right? So you had an unskilled male adult would be 500 to 600 denarii, which was about $110,000. But then a more skilled, educated slave was 2,000 denarii and up, which is, you're talking about upwards of $500,000. What this automatically teaches us is the fact that slaves were not relegated to menial tasks. In fact, slaves could be broken up into two categories. You had the rural and the agricultural slaves, and then you had the urban and the administrative slaves. And even among these, there were menial tasks and there were managerial tasks. Now, there was a list compiled in the ancient Roman world that showed that there were 120 different jobs that slaves were doing. In fact, slaves were doing many jobs that free people were also doing. So as a slave, you could be an employee of a city, managing as a salaried executive or worker, similar to a mayor, and you had heavy responsibilities. As a slave, you could also be a business manager, managing a shop or ships that were sailing in and out of a port. And thirdly, you could be a farmhand, a cook, a maid, a tutor, a doctor, or even a prostitute. Now, what this tells us is that the only thing that the slaves in the Roman Empire all had in common was their enslavement. They all were owned by a master. But in reality, by their position, by their task, you could not really tell the difference between them. So when people try to say slaves obey your masters and reference texts like the book of Philemon, where Paul is like, I'm sending him back to you, and this is him returning a slave back to his master, quote unquote, the reality was these slaves were not necessarily the same as what we see in America. You see, in our country, historically, you knew a person was a slave by the color of their skin because there were no white slaves. So therefore, race or speech or position or job, you couldn't differentiate them in the Roman Empire at that time, especially because they were conquered by war. So there were a lot of free people, such as the Apostle Paul, who appealed to Caesar because he was a Roman citizen, even though he was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised the 8th day, as he talks about in the book of Philippians. So Paul was not a person who was a slave. He was free, but he was Jewish. So Onesimus could have been Greek, became a slave through the conquering of war. But what we clearly see here is that Onesimus, being a slave of Philemon in the city of Colossae, meant that he was probably an urban and administrative slave. Means he's upwards worth over $500,000. Not to mention, something else that people don't really note of that time, slaves also own slaves themselves. Now, when you look at that, you're like, wait a minute, slaves own slaves? Yes, this is how common and everyday this practice was. That tells you that Onesimus, as a urban and administrative slave in the house of Philemon, he could have also convinced other slaves, which means his leaving and departing and taking other slaves that were under him with him could have led Philemon to lose anywhere upwards towards $1 million to $2 million by him running to Rome. This is really important for us to keep in mind, that the slavery in the Bible, when it says slaves obey your masters, it's not the same as a slave on a plantation against his or her will being restricted and beaten and subjected to cruelty and rape and these types of things is not the same, because slaves own slaves. You never heard of a slave owning slaves historically in America. And secondly, these people were what we would consider a mayor, a person who's running a business, or a manager of a big Fortune 500 company could have been a slave at the time in ancient Rome. Last but not least, slaves were getting paid. They had money from their masters, so they could literally achieve what we call manumission, which means they could purchase their freedom. And sometimes slaves decided to remain slaves because of the prestige or the ability of their own master. They just like to be around them and learn from them. So clearly, the slavery back then is not the same as the slavery we're grappling with. And this really highlights what the book of Philemon is trying to address of how Christianity interacted with that concept of slavery in the Roman Empire. Now, in the next episode of Between the Lines, we're going to grapple with slavery in the New Testament and in the teachings of Jesus. He used slaves in over 16 parables. How do we reconcile that, and what is that really teaching us? You don't want to miss it next time on Between the Lines.